And I wanted to talk about the sleep because it's part of the mental health, I think, issue for the mother. And you mentioned that you've talked to someone who were saying that, the best sleep I had is when I was breastfeeding laying down. So let's talk a little bit about that. Like if somebody wants to improve, and there is still a lot of conception around that, okay, some people don't want to co-sleep, or some people want to put the crib in a different room, not even the same room. But like, what is your take on the sleep improvement, mental health, breastfeeding, all this? Like, what would be your advice on that?
Okay, so we've got actually some pretty good evidence on this now, which I think is exciting because, again, a lot of times people assume that if you're breastfeeding, you're going to get less sleep. Okay, and actually, honestly, I assumed it. I wrote it in a paper, so I can't take it back. It's out there. But here's the interesting thing, and this was really quite contradictory to what I thought. Mothers who exclusively breastfeed get more sleep. They get more sleep, they get better sleep. That takes them, the two variables that you look at with depression are total length of self-reported sleep time, and the minutes to get to sleep. Okay, so after you wake up, how long does it take you to get back to sleep? Or, when you're laying down to bed, how long does it take? If it's under 20 minutes, you're at low risk for depression. If it's 25 minutes or longer, you're at higher risk. And so actually, one of the articles said that, the minutes to get to sleep was one of the best predictors of depression. Because again, I think a part of it reflects that sort of hyperarousal state. So why would breastfeeding influence that? Well, obviously, you're shutting down the stress system. And so even if you're not exclusively breastfeeding, you're going to get some of that effect because, you're still temporarily shutting that down. Okay, but for exclusive breastfeeding across the board, they had, better mental health. I mean, yeah, some of them were still depressed, but it was less, significantly less. Better depression and anxiety, anger and irritability, minutes to get to sleep, their sense of, how healthy they thought they were. That was actually one of the big variables. And also too, I think their self-reported physical health, which is, in health psychology, that's kind of an important variable. One of the things that it actually predicts is premature mortality. Now, I'm not thinking that that's necessarily relevant to new mothers, but it shows you it's kind of a big thing. Like they do these longitudinal studies and they ask people, they give everybody physicals at the beginning, kind of determine they're all actually in good health. And then the people who rate their health as fair or poor are more likely to have died at the next point. So I mean, it's big. And again, if you're really kind of going through your life feeling like, oh, my health is so bad, especially I can't do anything about it. You think about it, it's kind of like almost that hostile worldview and stuff, but you're kind of directing it towards yourself. It does make a difference. And we found that was one of the variables that was better. And again, I think it really has to do with that shutting off that stress system. Okay, now, then a lot of people asked me, they said, well, how does this fit in with sleep location? So I thought, okay, this is interesting. So I looked, and sure enough, the mothers who had the lowest rates of things like depression were the mothers who were exclusively breastfeeding and, and co-sleeping, bed sharing. Okay, those mothers had the lowest rates. But then we found something we didn't expect, which is the mothers who were not exclusively breastfeeding but co-sleeping had really bad outcomes. It was taking them longer to go to sleep. They had more anger and irritability. And I thought, wow, interesting. Hadn't expected that. Yeah. And it's like, I think it's because they don't get that shut down. And also too, they don't have a way to kind of soothe the babies to sleep like somebody who's exclusively breastfeeding does. So it didn't seem to actually be good for mental health. I mean, I remember I had a grad student who was saying, oh, co-sleeping causes depression, anxiety, and I said, no, it doesn't. Well, when I put those two together, I thought, well, it can under certain circumstances if they're not exclusively breastfeeding. And so it was pretty much across the board. I was actually really surprised by that. I mean, it was noticeably. So in that case, what I would recommend is like, okay, let's have the baby near mom, so that she can respond to the nighttime needs of the baby. Again, like I said, a lot of times you can't work with perfect situation. You got to work with what is. And so, you've also got to think about, is it safe for them to be co-sleeping? Okay, so one of the big no-nos is if they're smoking. No smoking, no bed sharing with smoking. No bed sharing with using substances. Even prescription ones. You really got to be careful with that. Anything that's going to impair the mom's ability to know where that baby is when they're sleeping. That's the thing. The moms really seem to kind of like connect on a hormonal level with those babies, and they know where they are, and they're more likely to sleep face to face with them. What Helen Ball has kind of shown is kind of across the world, the pattern that breastfeeding mothers often show, and co-sleeping mothers, is they kind of form a little cocoon with their body, and then they have their knees up, and so it makes a little nest, and the baby's naturally sleeping on their back, but they're getting turned because they're reaching to our mom, so those are the protective things that you need, and you need to make sure that there's not fluffy, bed thing, nothing that they can get wedged on, so then, in that case, it is actually safe to co-sleep. So what do you do, like if, you've got a breastfeeding mother who smokes? Well, you don't want them in the same space. They don't know exactly why it is, but it does raise the SIDS risk quite a bit. But having the baby near in their own separate space does work. They did this with the Maori tribe down in New Zealand because, they were all breastfeeding, but they all smoke. And they had these really high SIDS rates. And so they had them, they have these weavings that they do within that culture. And they're beautiful, gorgeous things. They had to make these baskets for the babies, like kind of like a Moses bed. And they would put the baby in the basket in the bed. So the basket would be sitting in the bed. And drop the SIDS rates. Bam. So a lot of times there's things that are kind of workarounds. We call those, like when you find a solution that kind of goes around the obstacle. So having the baby near you so you can just kind of reach over and then put them back in their own space. And honestly, some mothers feel better having the baby in their own space. But I think the important thing is no matter how you're feeding that baby needs to be in the parent's room for the first 6 months. It does really lower the SIDS rates. There's just something about that connection. If they're kind of down the hall, their SIDS rates are quite a bit higher.
Yeah, and I think that's still very important to emphasize because there's quite a bit of parents who still somehow believe or were said to that, the baby should be in the separate room, otherwise you wouldn't be sleeping, or they will be too attached to you, which is like,
and
as if it's a bad thing.
What kind of ridiculous idea is that? How can you be too attached to your mother? That's absurd. It's like, when they get a little bit older and they start getting a little more independent, but in the infancy stage, the attachment to you is what you want. Yeah.
That's true. That's
and it's like it seems to actually again be this system that actually also helps mothers' mental health because they actually sleep better in that situation. It's weird because if you compare formula feeding babies to exclusively breastfeeding babies, the formula feeding babies sleep at a longer stretch, a longer time at a single stretch. They also wake less frequently. Okay, so looking at those two things, you would think that the breastfeeding mothers are getting less sleep, but it's actually just the opposite. Even though they're waking more and the babies sleep a shorter amount of time, the mothers are reporting more total sleep. And it's very consistent with all of the other health signs. They're still tired. That's the other thing I think sometimes people say, and they say, well, I breastfed and I was tired. Okay, well, there's tired, and then there's more tired. Okay, and the question is, if you start supplementing, you're going to be more tired. And the answer is very clearly yes. More fatigue. You're going to see more daytime fatigue. You're going to see poorer sleep quality. And that's pretty much across the board.
Yeah, that's great.
So there's a lot of kind of myths associated with that. And again, this, we can talk a whole thing about this ignoring the babies and stuff like that. I think that's terrible advice. I really do.
Yeah.
And I come at that from a trauma survivor, from a trauma, perspective, because as a trauma researcher, I know that when a baby is very distressed and cry, they secrete a lot of cortisol. Okay, and what you don't want is chronically high cortisol with a developing brain, because cortisol actually affects brain tissue. And so it's like, why would you want to expose your baby to that? That's really not a good idea.
Yeah, it is.
It actually, in adults with depression or PTSD, it actually shrinks parts of the brain. So it's like not good. So we want to actually make sure that they don't do that. And responsive care seems to be, I think, a very important thing in terms of establishing a secure attachment, with the mother or the primary caregiver, but that responsive care, that's the real key. It's like the biggest thing you want to do in this period is you want to establish that secure attachment. So this is what I kind of say, to moms who, for whatever reason, breastfeeding didn't work out. We can still establish a secure attachment. And if you look at it kind of in the bigger picture, That's not the consolation prize. That is the prize.
No.
That's the big predictor, of how those kids are going to do. If they get that responsive care early on and they establish that secure attachment, it creates a resilience in them to weather, other things that might happen in life. So that's kind of a huge issue. So yes, sleep is a really important part when we start talking about that responsive care.
And I think that's the sleep bit is actually, like, even for people with the good intention, they might actually, neglect their kids in the very early stages by trying to teach them sleeping correct, or the way, all this sleeping training, even if you are present there, but you don't have to touch your child, or you have to, go away on these variations. Okay, this is not a cry out, but you're still not there. Like, it's crazy stuff. So I think it's important to, emphasize this bit as well.
Well, and I also want to say to parents who may have tried this out, and then they hear, cortisol had damaged their brain forever. No, kids actually have a certain amount of resilience built in them, and it's like, if that happens in the context of overall loving parents, kids are probably going to be fine. Okay, but I wouldn't recommend this as a practice. I don't recommend this at all as a practice. And people kind of say, well, that's you, and we can do that. And it's like, okay, but the cortisol for me is kind of like a bottom line. It's like, it's not a good thing. Now, again, like I said, I want to say, if, a couple of parents have maybe tried this for a bit, and then they kind of decided not to, it all is not lost. It absolutely is not. That kids can endure things. That there's a certain amount of resilience in there, but you don't have to be perfect, in other words. But I don't think this is a good practice to recommend.